Hello and welcome to the Love and Compassion podcast with Giselle. We believe that love and compassion have the power to heal our lives and our world. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more amazing content. Today, we'll be talking about how mindfulness can actually positively impact a culture. I'll be speaking to Ashley Williams, voted top 40 under 40 by Styled Weekly and Richmond's Magazine's Daring Women of 2018. Ashley is a certified yoga specialist, a creator of Mindfulness plus Movement RVA, implementing therapeutic interventions, programs, and professional development training that combines social emotional learning, mindfulness, and movement. She's also founder of Verso Yoga and Wellness in Richmond, Virginia, intentionally created to make yoga and wellness accessible to the Black community, but welcomes all communities. Please join me in welcoming Ashley. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Giselle.
How are you?
I am well. It's so beautiful outside. I've been bird watching
Hmm.
as I move from one place to the next and all the different environments. So I'm excited to sit down in this moment and just take in this conversation and the house that I'm sitting in.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I think that goes to show about the embodiment. So you not only teach the stuff, you live it, right? Can you tell the audience a little bit about how it is that you got started in this work?
Yeah. So my mindfulness journey, or I would dare to say my love for being present in the moment and all the ways that one may maybe lead to it, started for me in 2012 when I really just kind of was at a big transition of my life from, collegiate life to professional work life to moving new locations and really experiencing a lot of the transitions and the feelings and the sensations that came with transition. So, moving in the ebbs and flows of daily life, moving in and out of feelings of anxiousness, but then also moving in and out of feelings of connection and disconnection. And I ended up having a loss that of one of my aunts that was really dear to me. And on top of all of the sensations that were coming from the transitions, that was another transition that really that created a lot of disconnection and a lot of heavy emotion. And so I found myself first at a yoga studio
Mm.
and in a class and moving my body. And I just remember feeling that moment of connection with all of the sensations that I was experiencing. So all of the pain that I was experiencing, the sorrow, a lot of the loss and the grief that I was experiencing. I had a moment to actually feel it because for a moment I had withdrawn from it, and that was also not a good feeling. And there was something about being present in the moment with my body, with my mind, with the emotions of my heart that kept me coming back.
Mm.
And from then it went from, that yoga asana, that movement-based practice to really diving deep into the study and the science of mindfulness and understanding, MBSR, so mindful-based stress reduction, and literally practicing it every day in my world. From the brushing of my teeth to the sipping of my coffee to mindful communication when I was around others. And then from there, honestly, it's just really snowballed into wanting to know more and getting curious about myself through the practices, wanting to dive deep and study the practices, wanting to then share the practices and also not just, the formal practices, but then also the benefits of being in relationship with these with this science, but then with this also way of living in a way that had been benefiting me so much.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think being present with our difficult emotions is so important for healing, right? But often we don't do it because it feels so uncomfortable. What helped you get through some of those uncomfortable feelings?
Yeah. The practice itself, so the definition that when people are like, what's mindfulness? Or, how do you practice it? And, the simple definition that I always land on is, it's simply paying attention to the moment that's at hand. It's the paying attention to the presence and with an attitude of compassion, with an attitude of non-judgment with an attitude of acceptance and acknowledgement. And so that active practice of really checking in with myself, like, what's going on with my body right now? How's it feeling in this moment? How's it responding to my environment? What's happening in my environment right now? Like, who's around me? What do I see? How does what I see affect me? What do I hear? How is my body responding to that? And there's those moments of check-in to just like pay attention that have really allowed me to move through uncomfortable moments, specifically when you bring in like the non-judgment and like the acceptance of them. I always like to say that, stress, which can be synonymous with tension or pressure or disconnection, disease, that's the gray matter between like what one may think should be happening versus like reality. So like what is actually happening. And so I have found that my most uncomfortable moments are moments in which my mind has conceived or thought something completely different should be happening than what's actually happening in reality. And so just that point of awareness for me has been a game changer to how I get through them, because then I can ask myself the question like, okay, what am I trying to change about this moment?
Mhm.
Or like, what part of this moment don't I want to feel right now? Because I feel like I should feel completely different. And that can even be with like pleasant emotions,
Yeah.
like in moments of celebration. It's like, oh my gosh, like it's sometimes uncomfortable if, a lot of tension's on you and you're celebrating and you're like, "Oh, I just wanna go sit in the background," right? That's very much
Mhm.
uncomfortable, and so being in the practice of acceptance
Mm.
without any judgment has been a game changer, and returning back and back to it over and over again in the moments when I feel uncomfortable.
I love that. And I completely resonated with your answer. We call it allowance. Like, can we just allow anything that is experiencing in the moment? And it occurred to me as you were talking that I felt having that presence with yourself, like that, having showing up for yourself in a way that honors every aspect of yourself, I think leads to extraordinary things because you're being there for yourself. It's a form of love. It's a form of being fully
Mhm.
present with the being that you are in everything that you're experiencing. And so I really felt that as you were talking. So I
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Yeah, of
I,
course. One of my values has been like maintain constant love.
mhm,
It's an ode to my aunt's life and what started me on the journey. And so I always have to ask, like, how can I show myself the most love? How can I be constant in love? How can I allow what's happening and still be in a space of love, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and then also extending that to those both people and places and people around me. So love is definitely at the root and at the core of even why I continue to stay in this practice of being present.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember at one point in my journey, I remember asking myself, can I love everything and everyone? Can I love everything that I'm experiencing? Can I find love for it? And can I find love in that source or that God in other people? And sometimes it's a struggle, but there's a willingness, and that really is what keeps me moving forward and trying to understand the whole concept of love. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement with the mindfulness movement in the school system? Can you talk a little bit about how you got started and maybe some of the outcomes you might have seen in terms of mindfulness in the schools?
Yeah. I think one thing's important is to, as I start out, really going back to that definition of, mindfulness being present in the moment, right? And bringing in compassion, right? And
Hmm.
bringing
Yeah.
in non-judgment and acceptance. And have you mentioned allowance? And so that's really been the premise of a lot of my work when it comes into the schools. And so I began in at the very early of my career when I was working in a lot of mental health and behavioral health settings with youth and young adults. And at the time when I was finding the practice, I was also working with other individuals that were experiencing varying situations in their environments, might have also experienced a lot of the symptoms that come from having some type of mental health diagnosis or behavioral health change. And so when we think about being present, right, with
Yeah.
those, that can be a challenge depending on what it is and the supports in which one have. And so when I was going through my own transition and found the practice, I got really curious about what it looked like to then teach and educate and create space to be in some of the practices that I was learning within the environments that I was working in. So it kind of happened very much at the same time of my own self-discovery and my own journey. And so I was really curious about more specific how to use these practices and environments that we know that there have been experiences that have led to trauma. And so went and did a lot of studying just around like diving deep into trauma, the effects of what trauma looks like in the body, the effects of what trauma might look like in environments, the responses that
Mhm.
someone that might have experienced certain types of trauma from grief and loss, from neglect or abuse, from even like poverty and low
Mm.
socioeconomic statuses and the facts that, our social determinants really have on our health. And so as I studied those, the one thing that really lit me up and ignited me to really want to advocate for these practices within institutions like schools and hospitals or youth and adult programs were the simple fact that a lot of the solutions were met with pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And, one thing that I think our practice, if we dive really deep into it, being mindful is all about knowing who we are. And there's certain things that I think can also be barriers to that. There's some things that can be supplemented, that can supplement our identity and our experience. And there's some things that can actually be barriers and not allow us to really even connect. And so I got really curious of two things, what it looked like to teach these skills that in which we hold, that we can learn as humans, as an individuals, and we can strengthen them and they come from within with practice. And it invites us to return back to ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And so versus, what does it look like to rely or to be in usage of a substance, whether it's a pharmaceutical or maybe even another substance or drug. And so I got really curious about that and wanted to figure out ways to really introduce it. And so I started practicing in the environments that I worked within, using group classes and
Yeah.
small tutorials, teaching people about like their senses. But I think the one thing that really kind of ignited me was the way that there was also a curiosity from other people, right? Like more specifically for my experiences, as a Black woman working in predominantly Black environments or predominantly like environments initially starting out at the very beginning of my career about 10 years ago, but working in environments in which proximity to education around holistic practices or contemplative practices were not ones that were at the forefront, right? So creating space to reduce that disparity of education around mindfulness or contemplative practices really lit me up. And so started teaching it within the institutions that I was working within and really at that time really trying to advocate for it, right? So
Yeah.
in 2012 and 2013, I guess that's like 12 or 13 years ago, there wasn't much high level mindfulness practices specifically within our school systems, within our juvenile correctional centers. You might see more yogic philosophy practices. And of course, we pull our mindful practices, in relationship to those, but we didn't see kind of like a holistic model of all the different ways in which mindfulness could be shared or all the different ways in which healing practices could be offered and utilized to address some of the mental and behavioral health challenges that both our youth and our adults, whether they were being provided direct care or they were individuals offering the direct care, so like employees or maybe
Yeah.
even the leaders or the administrators that were then creating the spaces for direct care to happen by caregivers and or learned professionals. And so at that time, I did a lot of PowerPoints and I did a lot of requesting presentations. I also did a lot of like work and saying, hey, like just let me show you that this works. And so doing it at no cost and really meaning to make sure that it was accessible. And then over the years, I think what the practice does too is it works, it shows up, right? So there's so much power in the practice, and people see some of the outcomes as an increased focus or a balance a balance in emotion or regulated opportunity or improvement in self-regulation within environments. Clearer communication is one that I think comes up because, once again, the more that you know how to express what's happening in your bodily sensations or with your mood, there's an increase in improved relationships and healthy relationships because there's deeper connection and ability to express, whether it's creatively, verbally, non-verbally.
Mhm.
And so these are some of the things that we really started to see. And I can't, because my practice did start a lot with like yoga asana, I think one thing that's important is that was an inlet for getting present with the body,
Mhm.
and so letting people really kind of share how they found more ease in their body, they found more mobility and spaciousness in, their shoulders, they found a deeper breath and a longer exhale, which helps regulate the parasympathetic nervous system and decrease cortisol levels. So there's so many holistic factors that I think that we need to bring high level to, whether we are regardless of what, method we might be using to create more presence in our moment.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
You said so many important things. The first I'm going to focus on is the over medication of children. I was working in the child protection system and I was in quality assurance, so I used to actually talk to the young people and say, "How can we improve services?" And they would tell me about the medications and they would tell me about
Mhm.
how it made them feel and how they didn't find it helpful. And there was quite a high percentage of kids that were medicated, especially for ADHD. And I was like, what's happening? And in the end, it ended up being that people with trauma, like it can look like ADHD because there's so many triggers. And so I
Mhm.
don't know if that's an effective way to manage people that have experienced trauma. And one of the things I loved about what you said is like once we become aware of what people's histories are, their experiences are, we'll become kinder, more loving, more accepting and allowing of their behavior and get more curious about it than
Mhm.
saying, well, there's something wrong with you. Here you go. The other thing that I felt that was really important, and maybe we could dive a little bit deeper on, is the need for acceptance of a specific program at all levels. Right. So if you're going to the school, it's not just the kids that need the support, it's the teachers and the principals. How does that help sort of a program become more embedded within a system?
Yeah. I think that's key, specifically in the school environment that I work in, but I see it replicated in a lot of the school systems, is that a lot of the teachers also attended the same school district, the same school, and so you have very shared lived experiences. I think on the opposite end of that is that, you have some teachers that are within a school or leadership that's within a school that actually have very different experience than the students in which they have. And so I think one the purpose in mentioning that is because lived experiences can be very different,
Mhm.
right? But the human experience is very similar. And that's where the curiosity is meant to take place because sometimes those environments in which, you know, there's similarity in lived experience, but there's a difference in like the age. You might
Yeah.
see our kids' behavior different because it might have been something that you experienced or might have been something that you actually can resonate with or can't resonate with. If if it's your lived experience that might not have been a very pleasant one or have been unpleasant, then that can actually also breed heavy emotional sensation or thought. And so I think one thing that has been really important in working in this environment is really understanding the human experiences of
Mm.
both youth and adults and the structure of the school systems when we are introducing these practices that are inviting us into our present moment, meaning they're inviting us into our emotions, they're inviting us to our bias, they're inviting us into the way that certain sensations feel in our body. And so there's a holistic model that I think needs to be kind of addressed and how we
Mhm.
either deliver, implement, or even view what it looks like to create like a mindful school environment when we're centering the well-being. Because when we work with the school, and this is one thing that I found in my experience, is that we would work with our youth and we would have after school programming within the classroom, teaching various skills that enhanced creative expression, that, invited in more self-regulation, invited in
Mhm.
certain methods that helped communicate both verbally and non-verbally in a mindful way.
Yeah.
And we would teach them, we would have this classroom, we would have this setting, and then they would go into another setting, or they might go home where these practices not were not necessarily taught. So rather than creating a culture, right, in which it could be practiced or taught, and you're surrounded by individuals that, have the same characteristics or value systems, we were just building character. And there was nowhere in the culture to then practice the character. And so for me, it felt like while we were seeing benefits in the moment, which was like kind of like instant gratification, we weren't creating a system that really invited us to then be in practice, which we know, mindfulness is a practice. Being
Mhm.
a compassionate human is a practice.
Yeah.
Returning back to ourselves is a practice. It's not something that you're going to go into a 30-minute to 45-minute class. It's taught to you. You get an opportunity to experience it, and then you go back out, and then you don't necessarily see it around you. And so we felt that it was kind of sometimes doing a disservice in the long run, both for the time in which some of the professionals, like the mindful instructors, were going in to then offer, but then also a disservice to those that we were then sharing and building relationship with, like our students, because we didn't offer that long sustainability or long-term sustainability there. And so there's that. And I think when we think about with the teachers, it kind of goes the same route, where if
Mm.
we are then working specifically with the teachers, and then they are then wanting to utilize these within their classroom, then and the kids don't know them not quite yet, or they don't have the capacity to learn in all of their classrooms, there's sometimes a disconnect. And so that is one thing that has been a priority when working within school systems, is creating a whole school model where the same information that is shared with the youth is then shared with the teachers, is shared with administration, and then is also shared and goes home to the parents, because it requires practice and community to then really reap the benefits of the the characteristics that might come from those that are in relationship within a mindfulness practice.
Yeah, really well said. I completely agree with your perspective, because what you're trying to create is that culture of mindfulness, the
Mhm.
culture of compassion. Is the current program that you are involved in terms of the schools embedded within the schools, or is it something that is like project based?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways that I think that I could really answer that question, because one of the biggest challenges when you talk about funding has been the funding of sustainable work. I think that from an institutional side, the benefits that the practices offer could be hugely impactful, once again, for our whole school, up from the students all the way up to our leadership administration, and then dive deep into the community, because there's such a direct relationship between what happens in the school and what happens in the community. And
Yeah.
so we know on paper, if there was consistent practice in that, an engagement and a focus, that there could be huge benefits and huge impact on not just the lives of our students, but then the relationships that then create these ecosystems. So there's that. And when it comes to, I think, the funding for it, funding a lot of times comes from research, funding a lot of times comes from data that has occurred. And
Yeah.
so historically, mindfulness is really just, I mean, like I said, when I first started, there were on my hand, like, you could count on your hand how many people were really studying mindfulness, and specifically in schools and with institutions and tying it to education. It's just recently, over I think over the past 5 years, where we're really seeing a lot of, like, research funding kind of going into these programs to get the results. And so there's been a lack of funding to really support sustainable programs, and or you have to do a program that's going to reap a certain outcome, right? So there's some constraints
Yeah.
there. And so for the work that I've done, I initially started first and foremost, like I said, just really going in and being accessible. So a lot of the programming that I offered was not at cost. And so we either did it on a donation based schedule, in which schools could invite us in. And, I think one thing that I will dare say is that a lot of trust was built in moving
Mhm.
into schools in that way, a lot of deep relationship, specifically with something that people were curious about and didn't have a lot of information about. And so that then led to, some school funding that came. And more specifically, I'll dare to say it came during the beginnings of the COVID pandemic when the behavioral and mental health and the social health of individuals was really a highlight and really wanting to be addressed. And so my organization, Bare Soul, also in the Well Collective, also partnered with other organizations may be familiar, like Whole School Mindfulness,
Yeah.
which is, a global organization, and then other local organizations that really wanted to emphasize behavioral mental health. And so really doing a lot of partnership with them and together to create these programs within school settings. And so that has been something that has really ignited the work. I have served as a program coordinator and a trainer of mindful based restorative practices, is what we really kind of like to call them in the work that I do, a trainer for other educators and people that were volunteers so they could then help support and build capacity for the need. And then I've also served as a mindfulness director, specifically under the direction of what I mentioned, whole school mindfulness.
I love how, this has been like a community initiative, like you put forth your desire to provide assistance and be of service. And then you came together as a community to help and to actually impact humanity positively. This is why I think that these sort of initiatives can't be a one-off or funded by governments. They have to be embedded within the schools. The school system has to be incorporating these as a core practice, as a core value. It's the same with compassion. I think the whole system is shifting. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't know about schools in the US, but I know the schools in Canada. The things that they're teaching are very outdated. The
Mhm.
history is one sided. There's this great dissatisfaction around the way that the school system is managed. These old systems in general seem to be collapsing. And so now I think it's a
Yeah.
perfect opportunity for us to really determine, going back to your original comment, who are you? Who do you want to be? Like really understanding ourselves and really understanding then what do we want to create as a collective and as a system. And I think the foundation of that is the mindfulness and the compassion. I've been involved in many ministry government funded things, and sometimes it's just the flavor of the day. Like so now mindfulness is big, and then they'll dump a whole bunch of money into it, and then they'll move on to the next flavor. And it's like, no, this is important, and this is something that I think should be embedded. I
Yeah.
also think that the way that you guys are doing it, it is incorporated into the culture by teaching all those different levels. Have you found any sort of resistance among any group in particular, or has this always been like just generalized acceptance of the program?
Yeah, I mean, the resistance definitely, right? And, you just really named it, is that, I think, or I know that the systems that we've had in place, they're being outdated. They are falling. And
Yeah.
and the ways that we know that is because, the increase in mental health, the increase and like even school shootings, the increase
Yeah.
in dissatisfaction of teachers, and also just kind of like the increase in lack of funding to then support the things, or
Yeah.
and I think that there's so many things that, the more that, I know that I practice being present, and the more that the people that are knee deep embedded in this work, I do think that when you have more mindful individuals that are paying attention, we can see all of the things that are really going well and the things that are not. And so I think that's where the resistance comes, is that right now, I've found my resistance in spaces in which, the systems are not working, right? There's a lot of angst in within the spaces or the environments, and that can be school systems, that can be the government agencies that we might work with, or the ones that might have provided the funding for certain initiatives. And there's when we are able to highlight and or be able to name that something's not working and state that, resistance is going to come because that makes people uncomfortable. And I think
Mhm.
that's kind of really where we're landing right now. And so there's a lot that many of us are ready for. And then also there's a lot that our hearts just want to feel and do better,
Yeah.
because we are experiencing so much disconnection that's been amplifying all of these things. And so at
Yeah.
some point, it's like, when do we actually call change? And so for me, the resistance has really come when I have had the capacity to say, like, hey, this actually isn't working, right? Our kids' grades aren't getting better. We're seeing an increase in fights, like, and this is in the school system. But then even when we think about working with leadership, like, the teachers aren't happy, right? The teachers are, their well-being is not at the forefront right now, or, or our parents are, complaining about this, or our parents actually don't have the capacity to support the youth in this way. And then to come in and to say, hey, can we practice this? Like, is there a way that we can come in and have some communication? Because healthy communication requires presence, and it requires honesty and openness. And in those moments, there's a lot that can be brought up. And so the resistance that I've really, I think, faced is being able to clearly communicate what is present, right? And then offering up a solution, right? That is different than the way that, it might have happened before. It might not be a program, it might be really relationship centered. And this is how we're going to center relationship. And, that requires work and skill and practice. And at the end of the day, it requires time, you know,
Mhm.
and and so finding time within a school schedule, finding time within a work schedule that one is familiar with to even come and be in practice outside of an institution is, I think, a challenge. And, also one owns self-awareness,
Yeah.
right? And can be a huge challenge, whether it's, when I'm working within a school environment and a student is being introduced to something but doesn't actually know what they need. And then you offer them a practice and they're like, why am I doing this? Right. And
Yeah.
over time, they're like, oh my gosh, like, this is what I needed. And you hear the same thing with an adult, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I just want more calm. I want more ease. I want more, like, compassion for myself. I want to be in better relationship. And, you know, it might take 10 times to show up to be in a practice that has the opportunity to lead into that, because it's different, And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of different reasons why resistance can show up, both institutionally, culturally, personally, and individually. And so one of my main intentions is to continue to trust the process and to continue to be present with my own experience, and then also being curious and open, and also responsible for creating space where another person might be ignited to get curious and present about their own experience.
Yeah. And I think this is how we change the world. It's being us,
Yeah.
like, standing within our own emotions, being mindful, being an allowance, getting curious. Because when we can hold space for our own difficult feelings, then we can be open. I can be open and curious about you. I can be open and receptive to things as you hold space for your difficult feelings. And then we can engage in that difficult dialogue where people say things that are triggering or hurtful or whatever. And then we can still hold space for conversation versus what we do now as a society, which is cancel one another and shut down conversation because, like you said, we're not in awareness of how we're feeling. We're not in awareness of what we need in that moment. And so I do believe that changing a culture is each one of us doing that work that you are helping people understand to do, which is, I think, what is hopefully going to lead to the change. I wanted to circle back to what you had said, offering different perspectives or different options in terms of what we have done before. You'd mentioned how you had taught mindfulness in youth justice, or is that, did I hear that correctly? Or can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that? Because historically, with these sorts of systems, they're based on isolation and separation. They're based on punishment. We want to punish. And so to come to these systems and say, why don't we do something a little differently? Why don't we include yoga or mindfulness or compassion based training? I think it would lead to that resistance. What sort of reception did you find when you were incorporating such practices within the youth justice system? And what perhaps were some of the outcomes?
Yeah. So it's like, so I'll start with the resistance that came from kind of, adults like my counterparts, right? I think I laugh and I can laugh and I can say this with grace and openness, is that, I was the happy one, right? Like I air quotes the happy one, or the calm one, or the sunshine, right? But I was also working within an environment of individuals that had long hours, that were working in an environment in which there were many individuals that had varying experiences of trauma, right?
Yeah.
And burnout and compassion fatigue, and people had big hearts, and that's why they showed up in these environments, because they cared about other people. And there's also fatigue and there's exhaustion. And so I think that that's something that's important to name, of why I completely and fully understand why resistance was there. Because if you are, whether you were a guard, or I think we call them behavioral like specialists now, and you worked on varying units, and you not just witnessed but were in relationship and in conversation with, youth that, basically have your rights taken away, regardless of what
Yeah.
experience or what had led them there.
Mhm.
That's a limitation, right? That's a sensation of grief, of loss that you're surrounded by. So I
Yeah.
want to first and foremost name that I think the environments breed a culture, right? Simply by what is present in the human experience in those moments, of one that is heavy, right? And sensational, and one must be aware of that. And so one of the main resistance was, just, it's not going to work, right? Like, a little bit of sunshine and what might seem like a dark place is just not going to work. And so, like, you're wasting your time, like, or even the judgment of the youth that were incarcerated's like experience of being there, right? And so not finding that value, that, they even deserve to have improved focus or balance or ease or a calmed nervous system. So I think that was the thing. You really have to see the human experience and kind of move beyond the judgment of the experience that might be different from yours. So I think that's something that's important to name. So that whole perception of it's not going to work, they don't deserve this, or this, so we don't have enough time, or they're not going to be interested, was a very heavy one. And so how I got beyond that was that I kept showing up. And, of course, as young adults or teens would do anyways, you have to build relationship with them. I couldn't
Yeah.
come in and then teach them something completely different. I had to educate. I had to be in participation. I had to model being in
Mhm.
clear communication, and modeled an easeful nervous system and a tone of voice that was welcoming. I had to create a space of belonging and safety and support. I like using all of the tenets of trauma responsive practices, right? Of empowering voice and choice, and being open to communication, and understanding all of the identities, and what creating a space of belonging for all the identities that showed up. Like, you
Yeah.
have, like, those are key. And so that's one way that I did that. But then when it came to also just, even the departments at hand, or the departments that kind of really supervise the programs, really needing to advocate for funding. So I think, a lot of the roles in which, specifically when I worked with that, when I worked within juvenile correctional centers, funding, there's a lot of volunteer based work, which I think is helpful. And, I still say to this day that I would still be there. If COVID had not occurred when it did, and, kind of shifted some of my availability, I would still probably be there every week offering it in that way. And then also just thinking about the sustainability of what it looks like to do that. And so I think funding is one way that, a lot of the organizations, or that the department really named, that they might not have had the funding to support it, right? Or,
Yeah.
we don't see the benefits of it, right? Or, or the benefits that are right now, because a lot of times the way that we measure impact is, job security, well, which is right, but we measure these like very tangible things, like capacity to have a job, or they got released and, they stayed out this amount of time. Or even with us, right, it's that you we're judged up about our capacity to be in attendance at something, right? Like, there's markers,
Yeah.
but a thing that it's usually measured on something that is produced, not
Yeah.
necessarily something that which is then witnessed or built from a characteristic standpoint. And so I
Yeah.
think it's just hard to put money behind or to advocate. It's not hard to advocate, but it's hard to see if you're not a part of or in practice of it or in study of it to really acknowledge the impact that it has.
Yeah, and the whole issue of like trying to quantify, how do you quantify impact? It has to be something observable, which is why often governments will find based on outputs, not outcomes. At
Yeah,
least that has been my experience. It's like how many people attended, or like what's the low hanging fruit, and something that I could easily quantify, rather than
yeah,
what is a real long term impact on this individual's lives, and sometimes it's not as easily observable. And I think, we were talking about deservability earlier in our conversation. You were talking about we don't think that people deserve. But, as you were talking, I was reminded I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and she was mentioning how, when people are in corrections, right? You're asking them, like you put them in that environment, right? You put them with other people that have the same level of consciousness, energy, awareness, thoughts, and then you're asking them to do this Herculean thing about asking them to become better people. But they're in that same environment with those same people and treated harshly. And so, how is it that you expect them then to become loving, compassionate, like law abiding citizens? So, what you're inviting them to do is to do something different to help them regulate their bodies, to understand themselves so that they can understand their behavior. And that's really what gets us to change. But again, there's always that fear of like they were hurtful people and therefore we're not punishing them and therefore they're going to be hurtful. But it's, in fact, I found it's the other way. It's initiative like yours that enable people to really get in touch with that humanity, get to know themselves, and get to focus on their own deservedness. So yeah, so I think people underestimate the power of that, but sometimes our need to punish is so high. But it comes from a place of fear, right? Like if we punish them, then maybe they won't do it again. But looking at the recidivism literature, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
like you said, if it doesn't work, then we need to do something different if we want a different outcome. As Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and then expecting something to change.
yeah. And I think that's where we are right now, like just, as mentioning that our systems are not working. And if we think about
Yeah.
also like the punitive systems that we have, or, they're really built, from places of oppression, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
specifically in America, right? If we just look
Yeah.
about like how our country was founded and
Yeah.
who was valued, who wasn't, when did punishment come, and and who received it. And so I think that's something that's really key to acknowledge as we you
Hmm.
know observe and witness many of the systems that were created here, but then also brought from other countries and or established in other countries. So I don't think,
Yeah.
as much as I want to really focus on America, and many times if you're in conversation with me, I focus on the conversation of the foundation of Richmond, like and Richmond's tie to not just the American history, but then also the history of our country and its involvement with the transatlantic slave trade. And, there's so we can really, really
Yeah.
look at a micro level or a macro level, wherever our proximity is, to see kind of like how we have chosen to move away from valuing and understanding our humanity as a whole, but then also how we value and understand individual identity and the connection to humanity. And so I think we're really struggling with that as a people. And so these practices that are very ancient indigenous to us, right? So
Yeah.
being present with ourselves is a clear direction to being in relationship, right? And so,
Yeah.
as we think about how these systems were built, it was to keep people out of relationships with themselves. It's to uphold power and privilege in a way that, I think right now we're seeing the fall of that because we're so far away from our humanity and the way that we're actually meant to live as humans. And so
Yeah.
that what needs to change, and that's really that keeps me in my own practice, but then also keeps me advocating for creating space for all individuals in our collective to be a part of. Because I think the more that we find ourselves and the earlier that we start,
Yeah.
then the better our world is going to be well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that when we try to have those conversations about colonization, when we try to have conversations about, look at what we've done as a humanity. And I say everyone, because we've all contributed through acts of omission or commission, right? Like,
Yeah.
and if we're experiencing it, we've contributed to it. And so being able to hold space for those difficult conversations without ejecting out. So managing our own shame and our own guilt with love and compassion, with understanding and curiosity and non judgment will help us then understand, okay, this is who we've been. Now, is this who we want to continue to be? If not this, then what? How can then we then change ourselves to change humanity, to be more loving, to be more compassionate, to be more? But that takes, like you said, awareness of who we've been. And I think, especially in Canada, there's still like a huge amount of work that needs to be done about acknowledgement. There's been that acknowledgement of what was done to Indigenous people, but not a real understanding, not a real acknowledgement of like, this is who we were and this is what we did. And this is how we're going to move forward to not do that or be that anymore. And this is the sort of reparations and acknowledgement and things that we need to do for our Indigenous brothers and sisters in order to move towards being that. And I think
Mhm.
there's still sort of like, yeah, it happened, but can we move on already? No, we can't move on because we haven't changed. We have not changed. So until we are different, until we are more loving and compassionate and inclusive and don't need to oppress our brother to lift ourselves up, we can't stop looking at it, right? I wanted to talk just a little bit about you mentioned creating spaces for Black individuals around making it accessible to the Black community, yoga. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, like I came to, my yogic practice and journey in 2012, 2013, really at a time in my life of transition. And so when I was seeking, health, right? I was seeking myself. I was seeking ways to
Yeah,
take care of myself. I was accessing, and when I found like the practice to really complement my faith practice, right? So by trade, I am Christian. And, over the past 12 years, like really landing in that spirituality space. But at that moment when I first began, I looked around me, and when I was really trying to dive deep into the yogic practice, I didn't see many people that looked like me, right? I would go to the gyms and I would be always I would be like one, if not one of two people of color or Black women and also Black women, right? So I think that's a thing
yeah,
too. So just both gender and as well as racial identity. And the more that I practiced and the more that I felt better, I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to ensure that people that look like me also know about this practice because, between my mom and my dad and, my uncles and my uncles and my uncles and my aunts and my cousins and my friends, there was stress that was present in varying ways as
yeah,
stress does. And I was like, this could be an answer or at least a method in which, we learn more about and a philosophy that we learn about. And so, that to me was that was really my first desire is to really want to increase representation of people of color are welcome to use this. Like it's an ancient indigenous practice, right? Like, and I think our society and our media has done a really good way of defining and making, such an ancient indigenous practice one that, comes from a lot of different places with a lot
mhm,
of different cultural backgrounds and relevancies and
yeah,
philosophies that I think in America, we kind of shifted what that looked like specifically during that time. I think we've done better. So increasing
yeah,
representation was key for me, increasing opportunity to education, but then also decreasing health disparity through this practice was something that was really important to me. And so really wanting to dive deep into that. I think one thing that we learned though, and so I'm 12 years post really engaging in this practice and sharing it is that when you create a space of belonging and inclusivity and welcoming and representation for really what is historically marginalized community or underrepresented, you actually create space for so many diverse identities because it comes back to that human experience,
Yeah.
right? It's like when you can see, you then really see everything. And so the people and our students that were attracted to either practice with myself or within the spaces that was created, then also could take that out and then create a more belonging space for the identities that showed up and then bring in even their identity. And so we are a very diverse community now. And so one thing is my journey began with the physical practices, pranayama and breathing and asana and movement and stuff. And today, I really am an advocate for the embodiment of the philosophies that the yogic practice teaches, but a lot of like Yoruba practices and other cultural ancient indigenous practices offer because it they emphasize restoration, they emphasize creativity, they emphasize freedom and liberation, they emphasize clarity and connection. They emphasize of interconnection, of self-study, of presence. Right now, for me, it's really creating spaces for people to embody many of the things that we might learn to enhance our self-awareness, to enhance our relationship with community, and to enhance our action, our collective action to create a better world. And so that's what's really landed me at the evolution of Bare Soul, which is the Well Collective, and really being a movement to kind of really understand that our well-being is foundational and we really need to call in presence and practice and community to get back to our humanity in very healing ways.
Oh, beautifully said. Perfect, perfect segue. Two more questions. The first one is, what is your definition of unconditional love?
Mm. It goes back to what I named the maintain constant love. Our human experience is founded in love. Like our foundation is love. And, if we can truly understand that love is an action, love comes through our speech, love comes through the
Mm,
way that we look or that we are, it's really an invitation to maintain constant love beyond what experience or environment or, yeah, experience or environment that's in front of us. And
mhm,
so, you
mm,
know, sometimes we say like it's beyond condition, but even that sometimes can be a biased statement. So for me, it's like it's going back to just maintaining constant love through action and then through presence.
mm. I love that. Choosing love, basically,
Yeah.
like constantly
Yeah.
choosing, just choosing. Oh, I love it. So tell us a little bit about your website. Where can people find you? Where can people work with you? Where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, so I invite you to be in relationship with me. You can find me at www.iamashleyWilliams.com. That will lead you to all of the what's that are centered on my whys of community and connection, of love and of liberation. And so I'm all things the Well Collective everywhere on Instagram, on Facebook, and also on the website, thewellcollective.space. You can find me in Richmond, Virginia. So whenever you are here, please come and say hello. I am creating this very beautiful and much needed center for healing and humanity through restorative practice. And when I say the Well Collective, anyone that believes that we all deserve to be well is invited to show up and care for themselves and then also care for their neighbors.
Ooh, love it. Love it. Check out the Well
Yeah.
Center and check out Ashley's website. Thank you, Ashley, so much for being on the podcast and for reminding me about just love for myself. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of the Love and Compassion podcast with Giselle. Yeah, see you soon.